This is StarPod Log, special number 12. In this issue, we discuss the first James Bond film, Dr. No.
You have entered a realm that extends beyond space and time. Broadcasting via subspace channels from Music City on planet Earth in the Milky Way galaxy, this is your ultimate source for information about vintage television shows, movies, comic books, conventions, and more. This is
StarPod Log,
the classic science fiction and fantasy podcast. Get ready to receive a transmission of epic proportions from your hosts, Nayar and Kogora.
Greetings and felicitations.
Hip hip hurrah, tally ho.
Hey, Cutie Pie.
Hey, Puddin'.
So, we are going into our next wave of StarPod Log specials. This time, we're going to talk about the movies that feature James Bond.
Sounds awesome. Let's do it.
Now, what was your first exposure to James Bond? Yours is similar to mine in that you found out through a family member.
My older brother was a big fan of James Bond, and I mean, I just watched it on TV at first. I mean, when the movies came on TV.
It was a Sunday night event. Do you remember that was the big deal? Is when a Bond movie would come on Sunday nights.
Yes.
During the repeats. Sure.
Yeah, it was neat. I mean, it was something that was fun to watch.
Same thing. My parents liked James Bond, so both of us grew up in the Roger Moore era.
Yes.
We could say he's our Bond.
He was probably the first one I saw, but I
Totally.
mean, with those TV movies, I mean, of course they had the Sean Connery ones too in the 70s.
Mm-hmm. I wasn't such a big Sean Connery fan when I was younger, because I just didn't think he was that cool. I didn't appreciate him until I got older.
I agree with that, yeah. Roger Moore was more my Bond at that time, too. I mean, he was the one that was more handsome. I think he was more suave, and he was a little more aloof.
Okay. So, looking at this movie when we were younger is very different than when we're looking at it when we're older. We're seeing it through a whole different set of eyes. I know that for myself, I was really obsessed with going to the minutia of James Bond just after high school. So I started reading the original Ian Fleming novels and comparing them with the movies. Started watching them in the order of production and then in the order that the books were, because the books were written in a different order than the movies.
Yeah, they had to make the movies like depending on which script they could do and what was available at the time.
And Dr. No they started out with because it would be the easiest one, even though it wasn't the first book. It was super easy. It was minimal locations and minimal actors needed. Some of the books, to translate them, would be much more expansive to use a worldwide locations, real locations, or even making sets for them. So I see the mechanics why they did it this way. Hey, we're just getting a message from M. Check this out. Matt Sherman is on the line, and he's going to be jumping in later on. He's going to be talking about James Bond and this phenomena that we love. Now, for those who don't know, Matt Sherman is a top Bondologist. He runs Bond fan events, and he's appeared internationally on television and in print, and has led Bond fan events and locations tours across the U.S. and overseas.
We met him at SpyCon a couple of years ago, which was the only SpyCon at that time.
Mm-hmm. A convention that focuses on James Bond and spy culture, but his collection features all kinds of rare things from the stars, the authors, screenwriters of Bond, and I know that he runs tours around the world and even cruises. So we're going to wait for his input on this awesome movie and especially how it compares to the books. He has more insight than we do on that. It's been couple decades since I read Dr. No. But we just rewatched the Dr. No movie. It was released in 1962, and that's
the first one.
The first
okay,
one,
so,
yes,
yeah.
Dr. No. And it was pivotal because we look at what was going on in 1962. The space race was being led with John Glenn's successful orbiting of the Earth. The West Indies island of Jamaica declared its independence from the British, and the Cuban Missile Crisis was going on between the Americans and the Soviets. So if that was going on in the real world, we could see why this movie was a hit with fans.
It was very relevant at the time.
Yes. These were books that were very popular, so there had to be people watching the movie that already read the books. And some might have grumbled, might have complained because they did veer off a little bit. Not so much early on, but later on they really went wonky. I remember Moonraker was really different. But I imagine it must have been, if there was the internet at the time, it must have been like fans today reading the Lord of the Rings books and watching the movies saying, that wasn't in the book, I don't like that, I like that better.
Yeah.
But we only know it from the movies primarily. That was our first foray into Bond.
So this movie, I mean, well, you're the one who read the books. I didn't. So
The thing that I remember about the books that was very different, I know that there's a lot of minutia that Matt will no doubt talk about, but the big deal was Dr. No died in bird poop, or like ground up bird poop. That was a pivotal point of that island of what it was producing. But we're not going to talk about the books. We're going to talk about.
I'm glad that wasn't in the movie.
Yeah, I think some of the things that they tweaked, they said, this isn't going to be good for the movies. Let's change it around a little bit.
Well, this movie was made on a pretty low budget for a movie, and I know that's one of the reasons they chose it. The reason they chose this particular book to use is because they could make a fairly cheap movie out of it. And they did hope to make a series of films, just like it was a series of books.
They were planning on it, yes. They were planning on it. And it was a time when we could say that this, because of what was going on in world events, this was ultimately the birth of all these spy genres that would become popular in the 60s, like The Man from U.N.C.L.E., I Spy.
And my favorite, Get Smart, was still based on it. I mean,
absolutely, because it was a phenomena in itself, doing just the whole spy business. The opening credits and the music.
Well, they were very familiar. I mean, to us, now that we've seen a lot of movies.
Absolutely. But that's one of the things that Bond movies are known for. That theme music, that iconic theme music.
And so they hit it right. Right off the bat with the first movie, they had that music and knew they were obviously they kept it because it was so good, and it just became his theme music and what we associate with him. And
that's one of the things that when in our geek music library we have Bond soundtracks.
Yes.
That's always listed as the Dr. No theme. But you made an interesting observation with regard to the theme, that really should be the James Bond theme, and then that island music is more the Dr. No theme.
Right, because the James Bond theme, as I called it, was used in all the James Bond movies.
Whereas it rolls into, from the Bond theme, it rolls into Underneath the Mango Trees.
Yes.
And so arguably that could be the Dr. No theme. But that never comes up when we have compilations of the Bond themes, curiously.
I mean, it was later on that they got, someone to actually sing the song, like the theme song that was the name of the movie.
The second movie, From Russia with Love, they got a male vocalist, and then they started hitting a lot of female vocalists, and I think that's when some of the most iconic ones come from the female vocalist, arguably.
It could be, yes.
But, I mean, that theme is awesome, follows through in various iterations throughout the entire Bond franchise.
And the part at the very beginning where he's looking through a gun barrel.
Yes.
Yeah.
Another constant. And I think that's one of the reasons why we look at Starlog magazine. Starlog magazine started to report on James Bond because there were certain elements of borderline science fiction in the Bond movies. And once you start getting into gadgets and things like that, that's the science fiction element to it. And obviously Moonraker.
Yes.
That one, but
well,
also,
the gadgets and also the villains were so over the top.
Absolutely.
Like mutants.
Yes. But once you have a constant thematic expectations, it was like the Star Wars movies. You want that scroll to go up before the movie. That's how a Star Wars movie begins. A James Bond movie. You want that gun barrel. You're looking forward to it.
Yes. Yeah, I mean,
fantastic
you
intro.
cheer when that comes on.
Yes,
yeah.
Exactly. So I think it's one of the things that they did right from the get-go with this movie is they established precedents. They established a beginning. They established a theme song. And Sean Connery is making many establishments to the character, things that would become iconic, such as his introduction.
His introduction in the way he came out
The
in the
name
movie?
The name is Bond. James Bond.
Oh, yes. Yeah, definitely.
I mean, that is every Bond movie, especially when a new Bond comes up. You want to see, it's almost like a new Doctor Who.
He has to say that.
Let's see what the new Doctor's going to do. Let's see the new Doctor's sonic screwdriver. You want to hear how is James Bond going to introduce himself, and you want to hear him order a drink.
Shaken, not stirred.
Absolutely.
They even established that in the movie.
Right at the beginning. And in this movie, it was Smirnoff. Vodka Martini. So, this movie is so pivotal in establishing the cinematic character.
So many things that they used again.
But some of the things with the movie that, when we look at it, were trickery that they used back then. I don't think they use that so much now. One of the things that was they used the sets where the furniture was a little bit smaller than they would be in reality, so that James Bond would look bigger.
Interesting. Okay.
Okay, it's odd in itself. And
I mean, yeah, because he's the star, and so they wanted to build him up, and I mean, and they did, like over, James Bond has become such an over-the-top character through all the movies and everything.
Whereas now, a lot of fans, and myself included, I don't like a big-built James Bond. Again, we're leaning towards what we grew up with, Roger Moore. Roger Moore was lean. You know what I mean?
Yes, yeah.
Whereas the current James Bond, he's more of a buff guy.
Daniel Craig with
yes.
all the muscles.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it's an odd choice to want to make Sean Connery look bigger. I don't think he looked big in the movie.
I don't think he did, but it was just maybe they just had to make him look bigger than he was.
Maybe it was just subtle differences. Now, we didn't notice this as, number one, kids who watched it years later, but also as Americans, I don't think American audiences would appreciate it as much. But in reading about the movie, there was a painting was of the Duke of Wellington, and it was stolen in 1961 from London's National Gallery. So at that time, that was a newsworthy item going around. What happened to this painting? And they inserted that in the movie, and apparently the British audiences roared with laughter. Because it was to imply that Dr. No had the painting stole for his lair.
That was cool. That's a great idea to put in a movie.
Another element that we give credit to this movie is the Walter PPK. Another standard for James Bond right at the beginning. And speaking about James Bond armaments, we have to speak about the villain's armaments. What did you think about that tank?
It was neat looking. Now, we've seen tanks in other James Bond movies, too. But I guess for that time, it must have been a big thing, right?
Yeah, I guess so. And now looking at more as an adult, it's not so much a tank because it looked like it had wheels on it.
Yeah.
But it was like an armored car. I remember, my brother was really, really keen on James Bond collectibles. And, I mean, you've seen this house before. It's just insane, the stuff. But even as a little kid, I remember going to this store in the late 70s, early 80s called Railroad Salvage. And they were kind of like the Big Lots of the day. They would have things that were overstocked from stores. They had Gilbert James Bond toys on the shelf. So we were able to buy the Dr. No. It was like a 2-pack. It had Dr. No, that dragon tank along with the boat that split in two. It had Goldfinger's pool table. So these were all rack toys that were on the shelf. They had to be there for a long time, because those were released in probably the mid-'60s. They didn't start merchandising James Bond things until a couple movies later. But we had those toys as kids, and I remember playing with that little tank, and you'd press a button, and the tongue would stick out, and the tongue was like supposed to be like fire.
Okay, because they thought the tank was a dragon in the movie.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And that was one of those things, like, how can any adult, we're watching it saying, how could any adult not know that it's not a dragon?
And, I mean, I guess because we're supposed to think that the island people are very primitive and have never seen a tank before.
Yeah, please.
I mean...
both of you, Quarrel and Ursula Andress didn't know a tank between a real dragon. But it was cool. It was a cool effect. We have to put ourselves in the sense of someone in 1962. That would have been pretty cool, I think, for the time. First entry to a James Bond movie. So we talked about James Bond, the things he established in this movie. The story stands for itself, being made with the inner workings of what you said. It was relevant to that day of the missile crisis going on. But another thing that James Bond is established here is his weapon. We've talked about the weapons of the villain. What about the first of many arch-enemy villains? What did you think about Joseph Wiseman's Dr. No?
I liked him as a villain. He was so you get the idea that he's all powerful, he's wealthy, he has his own island, and he's in control of it, and he's in command of everyone there. And that's just your very typical James Bond villain. Plus the not having real hands.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So he was almost like a supervillain. Okay, let's just take a physical element of him and make him surreal.
Yes, like
I mean, when he took
like false teeth or some other thing.
When he started taking things and crushing them, that's when James Bond knew, okay, I'm not dealing with someone that's mentally insane, but he gets a hold of me, he's going to kill me.
Yes, the physical characteristics of the villain.
Mm-hmm.
And so what did you think of Ursula Andress?
And that's the other element, the Bond women.
Yes, it has established the women.
Absolutely, right from the beginning. I thought she was gorgeous. When
she comes up out of the ocean,
mm-hmm.
That's a classic scene, because I've heard people talk about that, how that was just like it was just the most beautiful coming out scene of a woman in any movie. And then they copied it again when Halle Berry was in a James Bond movie, when she came up out of the ocean.
Oh, I didn't realize that was supposed to mirror that scene.
Yes.
Oh, cool. Did not know that. I know that she's very light skinned in real life because she is from northern Europe, so they had to tan her for those scenes to make it more believable that she would be beachcombing. And I think that bronze skin with the blonde hair, absolutely beautiful, brilliant eyes.
And then they also dubbed her voice, right?
Yeah, they did. And that was one of the things that we found curious, is that you could tell it's dubbed. I guess audiences from decades ago didn't care as much, but we watched it like, this is super dubbed. What else did you think?
Jack Lord was in this.
Which is wild looking at that, because he could have been Captain Kirk.
That's right, he was considered for Captain Kirk.
But we know him for Hawaii Five-0.
And so was he even famous at the time he did this movie? I don't think
I'm
he was
going to guess
at that
not,
time.
because Hawaii Five-0 came out later.
Yeah.
So this is pre-Star Trek, pre-Hawaii Five-0.
And he really had a somewhat small part in this.
He totally did.
Yeah, and he really didn't, and he didn't want to come back, because the character he played came back in other films, but they didn't get Jack Lord because he
that's
didn't
another
want to
story, because
yeah.
as a kid, I was so confused. As a kid, watching these movies out of order, because you're waiting for the ABC Sunday night movie, so I don't know the order. no VCRs.
Right, yeah.
I don't know the order of the movies.
You can't look it up on the internet.
I can't look it up on the internet. I'm looking through magazines, whatever magazines that I could find, and you don't see a lot of old Bond stuff in magazines I had available to me. And it already was confusing because James Bond was going back and forth between actors, and now Felix Leiter was going back and forth on even more extreme levels. We'll get to that down the road. But we're establishing another, it's good you brought up Felix Leiter, we're establishing something else that's going to be a constant in Bond movies, that Bond has to come to the United States to help the CIA fix a problem that they should be fixing.
because it's a
this
British-made film, right? So, but I mean, and continuing the characters with different actors, I mean, that's done a lot. And yeah, because as a child, I didn't like remember the name Felix Leiter, so I didn't really know that that's supposed to be the same character, even though he looks completely different.
Yep. Yeah. Going back to the Bond villain, it's apparently Ian Fleming wanted his cousin Christopher Lee to play the villainous part, but instead Christopher Lee played a villain years later. So it's kind of funny how everything is intertwined. Everything is, there's links within the Bond characters with the Bond creator.
I mean, probably because there's so much history around it, and because they probably have considered different actors that they couldn't use at one time, but then they could use later. And with the character of Quarrel in this, when he first met Bond and he was acting like he didn't want to talk to him, and then when they became friends, when they found out they were working on the same side, Quarrel almost seemed more subservient to Bond. He kept going and saying, "Okay, what do you want me to do now?"
It was kind of awkward.
Yes, yeah.
Like for us, it was like, this is weird. But I guess at that time, 1962, that was a guy. And he's getting burned to death? What a horrible way to die. The movies from, especially the 40s and 50s, they tried to keep the books and the movies kind of sort of the same. Whereas within time, and now we know it's just anything goes with regard to adaptations, that it's not so much. We could possibly say this is the earliest stages of cinemafying a book.
Quite possibly, yes. Now it happens all the time.
So what did you think about the movie?
The movie was good. I mean, I liked the whole thing. It was a good story, the way it came together. Now the thing is, watching it now when you're already familiar with Bond, and the thing is, seeing that it had all the things that I expected from Bond. I mean, that was good too.
Yep.
I mean, considering it was the first one, but it laid the groundwork that they kept for the later movies was good.
We look forward to watching the next film, From Russia with Love. Here it is, incoming transmission. Matt from Bond Fan Events.
Hello, StarPodLog listeners. This is Matt Sherman of BondEvents.com. I'm excited to be speaking with you today about Dr. No as a book and film. By way of introduction to you, I've been involved in Bond fandom for many years and Bond collecting for many years, Bond Fan Events, and I've written a number of books on the James Bond phenomenon. My favorite, and the one that's most popular, is James Bond's Cuisine, 007's Every Last Meal. It's available internationally at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, other outlets. And it's a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun to write. It has tons of trivia, facts, information, stories, behind the scenes about James Bond's food and drink, because food and drink is often used as a weapon or a plot device, or for seduction, or for entertainment, or for lifestyle, and I think you'll enjoy that book. My wife Janine Sherman and I run James Bond fan events together. In fact, we're the only people running fan events on a regular basis in North America. So if you want to visit a James Bond specific convention, you would come to us, and at least annually we gather fans together to visit book and film locations in person, to meet Bond actors and Bond authors and Bond filmmakers. swap war stories, dine and play together, and much more. And fans have joined us from across the U.S. and Canada, and they've come to America and the Caribbean for events from as far as Europe, South America, and Asia to do so. I'd like to talk about that more later, but I want to start out with a shout out to the crew of StarPodLog and you as listeners. I'm glad you're looking more in depth at James Bond, since both the 007 novels and films are rich in both fantasy and sci-fi elements. That's something we talk about often at the academic panels I chair or co-chair. Each year I'm part of a group called SAMLA, South American Languages Association, and academics come together to talk about literary issues, and we get together annually and have panelists speak about Ian Fleming and the films. And that's also unique in the United States, so we hope you can join us for that as well. Talking about Dr. No, 1962, a grabber, the first James Bond film. Well, the roots of Dr. No, and much more than the roots, are in Ian Fleming's novel, since Dr. No is one of the closest, if not the closest, matched films to its Fleming book. Just like all the early Bond films, 90% of everything in the film is taken from Ian Fleming's wonderful work. And where the novel's a sharp departure from the prior novel, From Russia with Love, I'll talk about that in a moment, it was written in a reverse order to the first two Bond films. So Dr. No was the sixth Fleming title, From Russia with Love was the fifth, but for whatever reason, mainly the inexpensive opportunities in Jamaica, Dr. No was the first film, and From Russia with Love was the second James Bond feature-length film. Those were reversed. But how Dr. No was a sharp departure from the prior novel, From Russia with Love, is this. From Russia with Love is grounded and gritty and tense. And the opening of From Russia with Love, the book, which is a marvelous book, is chapters of Russians plotting behind the scenes to shame MI6 and set James Bond a horrible death trap. And we have these scenes straight from Fleming's mind, and he had been in Russia as a correspondent in the 1930s covering Moscow show trial, Stalin show trial. And we have these scenes straight from the evil headquarters of the Moscow apparatchik, and the Russian generals are talking and debating and plotting and trying to survive their own purges from Stalin's purges. And then we see the machinations of the Russians. Dr. No is completely opposite from Russia with Love. It's so much fantasy and sci-fi. It was a great idea to start this in-depth look at the Bonds with Dr. No for you at StarPodLog, because it's just rich in fantasy. It's a total departure from the previous novel. Now, you know, if you've seen any two Bond films, there's a formula that's followed to some extent, and to some extent Ian Fleming had a formula when he wrote the Bond novels, but I'm here to tell you, as an expert on books and films, the Ian Fleming novels are wildly imaginative. No two were the same. And Fleming was a daring risk taker and encoded a lot in the subtext of his books. So From Russia with Love is this real world thriller, and even President John F. Kennedy spoke about how he read the novel and he started to learn from the novel the inner workings of the Russian spy game. Dr. No is a fantasy island. James Bond fighting evil beasts, centipedes and spiders and poisons, and then going to an inhospitable secret island under tons of bird guano, bird refuse, to navigate a dangerous obstacle course and fight a giant squid and many, many things that are fascinating, but pure fantasy. There's a subtext too, by the way, in Dr. No that sort of touches the subtext of the film, and that's the subtext of illusion. Dr. No is constantly disguising himself and his team, and Bond uses a decoy instead of putting himself at risk. And much of the subtext of the Dr. No novel are people, including Bond's own boss M, trying to put the wool over Bond's eyes, but Bond can see right through them. As in every Bond title, Fleming would insert a particular character trait into Bond, tell you something new about the character and reveal it. And it would often be something that Fleming himself was fantasizing about. So in Dr. No, Fleming via Bond, because they were one and the same, Fleming was Bond, Bond was Fleming, there's a fantasization of James Bond being this super perceptual, perspicuous spy who can see through every falsity. He can see through every false trail. He can see behind every disguise. So Dr. No, the movie, because it's so close to the book, is a fascinating study. Because like the book, it's just a fun spy thriller where Bond is encountering real people and interviewing them and trying to deduce what happened when these agents were murdered from MI6. And as he plots through it or goes through it, he's doing pretty much what another spy that we can imagine would do, and it's just a little bit larger than life. And then at the end, it gets very, very fantastical and wild and strange, and Dr. No has his own island lair with his own chefs and his own illusory decoys who cover the top of the lair and cheat Bond and make Bond and Honey Ryder, the femme of the book, think that it's just a health clinic. It's not really a torture chamber. Pretty wild stuff. And again, in the film, first few reels, gritty spy thriller, really good movie, and then it becomes a bit more fantasy at the end, and the change there is Dr. No has a nuclear reactor. And there's a fight. And I don't want to give you too many spoilers if you haven't read the book, seen the film. A lot of fans haven't seen the film. It is indeed the earliest feature-length Bond film. And I urge you to see it. And it's a great place to start in Bond fandom or revive Bond fandom. If I may, I'd like to tell you about the reception that the novel had when it was first released. It received some extraordinary reviews, both positive and critical, because, again, the scenes in the book are on the verge of fantastic and sci-fi. And the book was well received and sold a lot of copies when it was released because the prior book, From Russia with Love, had somehow made it onto President Kennedy's list in Life magazine of his 10 favorite novels. If I can tell StarPodLog listeners about the differences for just a moment between the book and the movie, if you've experienced one or the other, it'll help you ground in. I'd say the key differences between the film and the book are this. In the novel, Bond has been affected by injuries and romance from the two prior novels, Diamonds Are Forever and From Russia with Love. But in the film, Bond was affected by who knows when, a sometimes past scrape with his gun jamming, and so he's assigned, famously in the film, as in the novel, a Walther PPK, replacing his beloved and small and easily concealed Beretta. Now, From Russia with Love and Dr. No, as I said, had been reversed, being the fifth and sixth Bond novels, but then becoming the first and second feature-length Bond films, Dr. No in 1962, From Russia with Love in 1963. The centipede Dr. No tries to kill Bond with in the novel has been replaced by a tarantula in the film. The film retains the great moment from the novel when Bond retreats to his hotel bathroom to be violently ill after he defeats the bugger. Dr. No's obstacle course is condensed to become more simply, in the film, the pathway Bond uses to escape Dr. No's prison. The film adds some action scenes while deleting other novel action, like adding Bond's fight with a phony chauffeur and the man's suicide. The film enlarges Miss Taro's role from the novel to make her a femme fatale for Bond. She tries to kill Bond twice in the films before she is arrested by Jamaican policemen. The poisoned fruit basket used by No against Bond does not appear in the film, but becomes a fascinating part of the novel's moves and counter-moves and Bond's sense of deduction in that subtext of he can see through Dr. No's artifice and his illusions. Dr. No is an independent operator in the book, paid by communist powers, but becomes a member of Blofeld's organization Spectre in the film. Spectre, of course, we all know is a special executive for counterintelligence, terrorism, revenge, and extortion, but is so prevalent in the Connery films that in his 7 films, Spectre are the baddies 6 times, except for Goldfinger. Bond kills No very gruesomely in the novel, drowning the man in his own export of bird dung, but he pushes Dr. No into a nuclear reactor's cooling vat in the film. And in the novel, Bond, No, Honey Ryder, and Quarrel have backstories, character strengths, complexities that are nowhere in the film. Ian Fleming was a master writer, and Dr. No is more than worth the read. You can start there. You don't have to start with the first Bond novel, Casino Royale. I didn't when I was a kid. But Dr. No is a very fun, fast-paced read with a lot of insight into the politics of the time and Ian Fleming's beloved Jamaica, as well as tons of action. and all the Bond formula we love, plus some new wrinkles that we haven't yet seen in the movies. You know, the 1960s movies are not often aired today for whatever reason. I mean, we see repeat films like Ten Commandments. Janine Sherman, my wife, and I just watched Ten Commandments over Passover, Easter, like we often do. Or on Christmas, you see The Greatest Story Ever Told about Jesus Christ, or you see popular Christmas films, or you see them on Easter again. But the Bond films are played continually. As a matter of fact, a friend wrote on Facebook the other day how he noticed that 3 different Bond films were showing simultaneously one evening near his home on 3 different networks. And these films have lasting, durable power for many reasons, and again, they're rich in fantasy and sci-fi elements, so a lot of fun for StarPodLog viewers and listeners. And overall, I would say the book is an excellent book, one of Fleming's better books, with a very fleshed out, exciting villain, and a woman, a femme not fatale, but a femme assistant to Bond, Honey Ryder, who helps him, saves him, succors him, gives him encouragement, and she has a great backstory. She's a strong female character. She's not a pushover. She's a feminist character. Ian Fleming wrote very, very feminist depictions of women, believe it or not, in his books. But overall, great book and a wonderful film. Some of the pacing of the film, people find it's a little bit slow. Again, it's a 1960s offering. It's not the souped-up, crazy, gadget-laden films that we have later, but a wonderful film and book. And I urge you to start your fandom there. And I'd like to share next, if I may, about 2 items of interest to you as listeners. My association with film props and my association with locations from Dr. No. I think it makes for some wonderful stories. Now, again, Dr. No has a wonderful mystique today because it's the oldest feature-length Bond film, and it's coming up on can you believe it, fans, a 60th anniversary in 2022 because it was aired in 1962. Now at home, Janine and I collect all kinds of interesting rare Bond books and film props, including screen used and also replica props. But as you can imagine, it's far easier to get items from the recent Daniel Craig films than from the early Bond films. And this is in part because back in the day, they never kept anything. They would just chuck out and destroy film props, or they would even transfer them to another set. So sometimes a savvy viewer will notice a particular lampshade or piece of furniture that's carried over from James Bond to James Bond film, or from a James Bond film to another Eon production or MGM United Artists film. But of course, it's in the recent 2 decades, really, that collecting has taken on a fever pitch, especially for film props, film posters, rare Fleming book titles, and people are hoarding props and trading props and horse trading props. Really hard to get something from Dr. No. So I consider myself fortunate indeed. What a blessing. I actually recently acquired plaques and chips from the 1960s casino that supplied gear to Dr. No. And the plaques have individual serial numbers, are very brightly colored. They're made in Belgium by Bergona Grasset, who makes most of the plaques for most of the casinos in the world for over a century. And they match the screen scene plaques that Sean Connery and others are using on screen in every way. And the plaques are serial numbered, but we don't know what serial numbers were supplied to the production, so for all we know, I have in my home now plaques from the film. It's been a joy. I got a good pile of them, so I've been selling a few or trading a few to contacts as well. Indeed, if a listener is into props or collectibles, you can reach out to me. I'm happy to help you. And I'm so fortunate, I really am, to have made a great contact and friend overseas who got a huge consignment of plaques and chips and decorative items from the casino. And that's been amazing. And I bet many of the listeners out there are enjoying Star Trek props and Star Trek costumes and costuming and cosplay. A lot of you know my good friend Dr. John Flynn, who helped bring in the advent of cosplay conventions in the United States and started the first Costumiers Guild and the first costume contests at conventions. And one of his fun projects was he has personally made and sewn and designed or redesigned a costume from every one of the Star Trek films. Well, that's the thing. These props are very difficult to get. They're very expensive. The film companies hold them, hoard them, resell them. but the film company is a lot more lax on the side of James Bond. And so while it's inappropriate to take things from a Bond set, until recent years they would give props to cast and crew as gifts. So if you're into props, get into it via James Bond is a great way to do it. It's very expensive to find an original series phaser. We all know that. An original series tricorder from Star Trek. But you'd be surprised you can find a lot of props from the Bond films. Or again, you have a dozen odd Star Trek films, but you have 25 Eon James Bond films, plus Never Say Never Again, Casino Royale 1967. You have 27 James Bond films to collect from. So I do a semi-monthly e-zine. If you want to reach out to me through StarPodLog or contact me or send me a note at baconbond@gmail.com, bacon like eggs and bacon, Bond like James Bond at Gmail, and I'll put you on my list, and I share props. I even sometimes share Star Trek props and replica props too from contacts, so that's been a lot of fun. So the Bond prop story is amazing. There's very little from Dr. No. It was all destroyed. There are several museums now in the United States where you can enjoy the James Bond vehicles. Friends of mine curate them, buy them, trade them, sell them. The Dr. No tank that is on display, or until recently was on display in Miami, Florida, is a replica because the originals were destroyed, dismantled. Second thing I want to talk about is locations. And again, we're so lucky to have the best in fandom with James Bond, with Star Trek, with other sci-fi fantasy. And there's even some crossover where amazing actors have been in both franchises, right? But as I've told people before, if I want to go to Vulcan, I can't buy a ticket anywhere. If I want to be at the Federation's headquarters in San Francisco, I can fly to San Francisco and walk around San Francisco, but I'll be unable to find Earth's headquarters for the Federation in San Francisco. It's a set. If you've been on the different sets as they've toured around, we were lucky to go, for example, on a Star Trek set at the Kennedy Space Center, or I was lucky to see original props and costumes and things in Las Vegas when Star Trek was housed there. As many of you will remember, at the former Hilton, which is actually a hotel that features prominently in the Bond film Diamonds Are Forever. But the long story short is you have to build your own fan film to go on a Star Trek set. Not so in a Bond. My book, James Bond's Cuisine, lists 500 real-world restaurants where you can visit and eat what Bond eats and drink what Bond drinks. And the locations of James Bond in book and film were very often real-world. Fleming very famously tagged real-world locations, real-world brands. His was the first modern novel to say, here's what the hero eats and wears and drinks and the brand of razor he uses and the brand of shoes he likes and so on. So you can visit James Bond locations. So Janine and I take people to James Bond locations. San Francisco, New York, Chicago, Las Vegas, whatever. And indeed, we have great opportunities coming up that I'll tell you about in a minute. But we've led several groups in Jamaica, but had never really gone to Kingston, Jamaica's capital, because normally when we lead a tour group in Jamaica, we're coming in off a cruise ship. And the cruise ships land on the north and western shore of the island, and Kingston, the capital of Jamaica, is in the south, where so many key Dr. No scenes were filmed. But a couple of years ago, we did a different kind of convention where we were housed for the whole week in Jamaica, and rather than cruising in, we flew in, drove folks down to Kingston, and got to see and reenact James Bond scenes. I blew everyone's mind because I do a lot of research for these tours. Every year I spend dozens of hours looking for locations, sort of a fun, can you top this? Can I take you somewhere no one's taken you before? And I brought the group to a certain place, and I took three of the guys together, and I said, you put your hand on his shoulder, you put your hand on his shoulder, so that they were the three blind mice, the famous assassins who opened up the movie Dr. No, by holding onto each other's shoulders and tapping their canes as they wander through Jamaica. And then they shoot Strangways, the agent from MI6, set Bond off on his mission in Dr. No. And I took them together and I said, who are these people? And they're like, we're the three blind mice. Is this where they filmed it? And then I take out screenshots or video and I showed them, yes, you're standing in the exact spot on the exact street in front of the very tree where they filmed this with a crew in 1962. And big or small group, we have tons of adventures on these things. We went to the Causeway near the airport where Dr. No was filmed, the main Kingston airport. And there's a side step off the causeway there to the main island of Jamaica where Bond has a battle and judo throws an assassin. And people have been wondering for years, where is that spot? Because you can't really tell on Google Earth, you can't really tell by mapping which of many coves it is. But when you have a group there and you have a chauffeur or a bus driver, you can stop at your leisure and look. So we spent time on that trip exploring. That is, the group was able to help me find a new location in person, and so on. So if you're interested in high adventure, join us on one of those things. We have a great time. And Dr. No, being so historic and being the first James Bond film, that's one of our most memorable trips ever, was to Jamaica, where they filmed so much of Dr. No and Live and Let Die, starring Roger Moore. By the way, in case you're wondering, Janine and I have a cruise scheduled. And you might say, how can you have a cruise scheduled with the COVID-19 crisis? Well, for over a year, we've had on the books a wonderful cruise leaving October 2020 from New Orleans to go to Key West and to go to the Bahamas, so that we leave from a Bond location and visit other Bond locations on the cruise. Over 50 fans have signed up. They have cabins for the cruise. We always have special guests and surprises and gifts and games. We do cosplay on the ship. Every day on the ship we have seminars, and every night we have a special activity. We even have people coming to celebrate a wedding or a honeymoon on the ship. All kinds of wonderful things. We have a ball. It's a non-stop 8-9 day adventure in New Orleans, the Caribbean, Key West. A lot of fun. Looking forward to it. And if the COVID-19 virus situation continues, we will roll everyone's deposits for the cruise to a 2021 cruise. So touch base with me. I'm sure your own StarPod Log hosts would love to go on something like that, since they are big Bond fans, and they and I have enjoyed James Bond events together. Thank you for listening to what I had to share today about Dr. No. And if you have any questions at all about the James Bond phenomenon, or you're looking for a prop, or you're seeking a location, or you're trying to track down a rare book, or Matt, how much is this collectible worth? Should I auction it? Should I put it on eBay? Just send me a note, Matt Sherman, baconbond@gmail.com. And thanks again to you, StarPod Log and StarPod Log listeners.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Please continue to follow and interact with us on both Facebook and Twitter.
If you use Apple IIe, Commodore 64, or Tandy computers, find us on your bulletin board system. Your 5-star feedback is always welcome.
Theme music provided by Checkpoint Charley.
Until next time, live long and may the Force be with you.
Nanu Nanu.